The golden light of the setting sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom like liquid honey, casting long shadows across marble floors that reflected the faces of 300 guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen waterfalls, each prism catching light and scattering it across the room in 1,000 tiny rainbows. The air was thick with expensive perfume, aged whiskey, and the low hum of conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and the kind of wealth that makes ordinary dreams seem like children's wishes. In the center of this opulence stood a young woman whose presence seemed to dim everything else around her. Not because she was adorned in diamonds or draped in designer silk, but because there was something in her eyes that money could never buy. A quiet dignity that made even the richest people in the room feel suddenly poor. Her name was Amara Obenawa, and she wore a borrowed dress that shimmered like midnight water, her natural hair styled in elegant braids that crowned her head like royalty. Amara's hands trembled slightly as she held a glass of champagne she hadn't tasted, her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it echoing across the polished floors. She had come to this gathering at the insistence of her best friend Zara, who had dragged her from her small apartment with promises that it would be good for her to see how the other half lived, to make connections that might help her fledgling career in business management. But standing here among titans of industry and socialites who wore wealth like a second skin, Amara felt like an imposter at a masquerade where everyone else knew the steps to a dance she'd never been taught. Her eyes scanned the room nervously, taking in the elaborate ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans, the waiters who moved like shadows with trays of delicacies she couldn't pronounce, the women whose laughter sounded like wind chimes and whose gestures were calculated for maximum elegance. And then her gaze landed on him, standing across the ballroom, surrounded by admirers and supplicants, yet somehow standing completely alone. Kwame Osei was a man whose presence demanded attention without him ever asking for it, a billionaire whose name appeared in business journals and society columns with equal frequency, though he seemed to care about neither. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, with shoulders that suggested strength carefully controlled, wearing a midnight blue suit tailored so perfectly it seemed to have been sewn directly onto his body by artisans who understood that clothing for a man like this was armor as much as fashion. His skin was the color of polished mahogany, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that made people look away after only a few seconds, because holding his gaze felt like staring into a furnace. They called him the Ice King in business circles, not because he was cruel, but because no one had ever seen him display genuine emotion, no warmth that wasn't calculated for strategic advantage, no vulnerability that wasn't immediately locked away behind walls built from years of betrayal and disappointment. Amara had heard stories about him from Zara, tales of a man who'd built an empire before turning 30, who could make or break careers with a single word, who was admired universally but truly known by absolutely no one. What Amara didn't know, as she watched Kwame from across that crowded ballroom, was that he'd been acutely aware of her presence from the moment she'd walked through the entrance 15 minutes earlier, that his eyes had tracked her movement through the crowd with the focus of a man who'd just discovered something rare and unexpected in a place he'd long ago written off as barren. He'd noticed the way she moved with a grace that came not from dance lessons or finishing school, but from an inner confidence that refused to be intimidated by surroundings designed to make people feel small. He'd observed how she smiled at waiters and thanked them when they offered her refreshments, treating them like human beings rather than invisible servants, something he almost never witnessed in his circles, where staff were furniture that occasionally needed to be told what to do. And he'd seen the moment her eyes found his across the room, watched the way her breath caught just slightly, noticed how she looked away quickly, as if afraid she'd been caught committing some minor crime of presumption. In that fraction of a second, Kwame felt something crack in the ice that had encased his heart for longer than he could remember, a small fissure that both terrified and thrilled him in ways his billions had never managed to accomplish. The story of how these two souls came to stand in the same ballroom on this particular evening, separated by 50 feet of marble floor and an entire universe of circumstance, began years earlier in two places so different they might as well have existed on separate planets. Amara grew up in a village in the northern region where the earth was red as rust and the sky stretched endless and blue above fields of millet and corn that fed families who measured wealth not in currency, but in community, in how many neighbors showed up when you needed help, building a fence or harvesting crops before the rains came. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 7 years old, their small vehicle crushed by a truck whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel after working 3 shifts in a row to feed his own family. A tragedy that had no villains, only victims and survivors trying to make sense of senseless loss. Amara had been raised by her grandmother, Mama Akosua, a woman whose hands were rough from work, but whose heart was soft as fresh bread, who taught her that a person's character was built in how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. Mama Akosua's house was a modest structure of clay bricks and corrugated metal roofing, 3 rooms that somehow held enough love to fill a mansion, where the walls were decorated not with expensive art, but with family photographs and the drawings Amara had made as a child, showing her dreams of cities she'd only seen in books, borrowed from the village school's tiny library. Every morning before dawn, Amara would wake to the sound of her grandmother singing old hymns in a voice that sounded like honey mixed with gravel, would help her fetch water from the community well, where women gathered to share news and wisdom in equal measure, would learn the names of plants that could heal wounds or ease fevers, would absorb lessons delivered not through lectures, but through stories about ancestors who'd survived droughts and wars and heartbreaks that would have broken lesser spirits. The village raised her as much as her grandmother did, each elder contributing some piece of knowledge or skill, teaching her to cook jollof rice that made people close their eyes in appreciation, to braid hair in patterns that told stories, to read the sky for signs of coming weather, and most importantly, to walk through life with her head held high, regardless of what she owned or didn't own. Kwame's childhood had been different in almost every conceivable way, though it too had begun in a village not far from where Amara was raised, a fact he rarely shared with anyone in his current life because it didn't fit the narrative people preferred about self-made billionaires who seemed to have emerged fully formed from business schools and boardrooms. His father had been a cocoa farmer with dreams bigger than his modest plot of land could contain, a man who believed that education was the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen or lost to bad luck or bad weather. When Kwame was 10 years old, his father sold everything they owned, uprooted the family, and moved them to the city where opportunity supposedly lived, where a brilliant boy might find schools that could sharpen his mind into a weapon capable of cutting through the barriers that kept poor people in their designated places. The transition had been brutal for young Kwame, going from a village where everyone knew his name and his lineage to a city where he was invisible, just another country boy with an accent that marked him as unsophisticated, wearing second-hand uniforms to schools where other children arrived in cars that cost more than his father earned in 5 years. Those early years in the city had taught Kwame lessons more valuable and more painful than anything he later learned in university. Lessons about how the world worked when you had nothing, about how people looked through you when you couldn't benefit them, about how quickly warmth turned to ice when you no longer served a purpose in someone's plans. He'd watched his father work 3 jobs to keep him in that expensive school, seen his mother's hands crack and bleed from cleaning other people's homes, witnessed their sacrifices compound and multiply until the weight of their hopes, for him, felt like carrying mountains on shoulders that were still growing. When his father died of a heart attack at 45, collapsing in a taxi on his way home from his third shift, Kwame had stood at the funeral understanding, with crystalline clarity, that his only path forward was to become so successful, so powerful, so absolutely untouchable that no one could ever make him, or anyone he loved, feel small again. That funeral marked the death of whatever softness had remained in him, replaced by an ambition that burned like cold fire, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. He'd built his empire with a ruthlessness that came not from cruelty, but from absolute focus, starting with a small investment firm that he grew through 18-hour days, and an uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. By 25, he'd made his first million. By 30, he was a billionaire whose company, Osei Enterprises, had fingers in everything from real estate development to technology startups, from agricultural innovations to luxury hospitality. He provided jobs for thousands, created wealth for investors, donated millions to causes that served communities like the one he'd come from, did everything right according to the metrics the world used to measure success. But somewhere in the climb, he'd lost the ability to connect with people in any way that wasn't transactional, had surrounded himself with walls so high and thick that even he sometimes forgot what it felt like to be touched by genuine human warmth. Women approached him regularly with beauty and charm, deployed like weapons in a calculated campaign to access his wealth, and he played along when it served a social purpose, always polite, always distant, always leaving them confused about whether they'd been on a date or a business meeting. Now, at 35, Kwame had everything the world told him to want, and nothing his soul actually needed, which was how he found himself at another charity gala, surrounded by people who smiled at him with their mouths while calculating with their eyes, wondering if this would be the night he finally let someone past his defenses. And then Amara had walked in, wearing a dress that probably cost a fraction of what the other women had spent on their shoes, and something about her had made him remember what it felt like to want something that money couldn't buy, that power couldn't command, that status couldn't guarantee. She moved through the ballrooms like someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere, comfortable in her own skin, but aware she was visiting a world that operated on rules she hadn't been taught. And that combination of confidence and humility struck him as the most attractive thing he'd seen in years. When their eyes met across the room, Kwame felt the ground shift beneath his expensive Italian shoes, felt the carefully constructed fortress of his emotional isolation develop its first serious crack, felt something wake up in his chest that he'd thought had died with his father 2 decades earlier. Zara Osei, Kwame's niece and Amara's best friend, watched the silent exchange between her uncle and her friend, with a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips, because she'd been orchestrating this meeting for months, with the patience and precision of someone conducting a symphony where the musicians didn't know they were playing the same piece. Zara had met Amara 2 years earlier at a community college, where Zara had been volunteering to teach business basics to first-generation university students, and she'd been immediately struck by this young woman who worked 3 jobs, attended classes full-time, and still managed to volunteer at a literacy program for children every Saturday morning. Most people in Zara's social circle talked endlessly about making a difference while doing nothing more strenuous than attending galas and posting on social media about causes they supported with their hashtags, but not their time. Amara actually showed up, actually did the work, actually treated everyone from the college president to the janitor with the same respectful attention. And Zara had recognized in her something increasingly rare in the world she'd grown up in: authenticity that hadn't been practiced or performed for an audience. As their friendship deepened, Zara began to understand the full story of who Amara was and where she'd come from. Learned about Mama Akosua, selling her most precious possession to give her granddaughter a chance at education. Heard about the village that had come together to contribute what they could to send one of their own, to pursue dreams they might never see themselves but believed in anyway, because that's what community meant when it was real, and not just a word people used in speeches. Amara never complained about working herself to exhaustion, never expressed envy of Zara's wealth, never tried to use their friendship to access opportunities or connections, which made Zara want to help her all the more, because it was so clear that Amara would never ask for help, even when she desperately needed it. And Zara, who'd grown up watching her uncle Kwame become increasingly isolated behind walls of wealth and wariness, who'd seen him go through the motions of life without ever truly living, had begun to wonder if perhaps these two wounded souls might be exactly what each other needed. She'd seen how Kwame's eyes had lingered on the photo of Amara on her phone when she'd shown him pictures from a community event, had noticed how he'd asked careful, seemingly casual questions about her friend over family dinners. The plan had been simple in concept, but required perfect execution. Get Amara to this gala, make sure she looked absolutely stunning, and then let fate and human nature take their course, trusting that her uncle would finally allow himself to feel something real, and that Amara would be brave enough to meet him as an equal, despite the vast difference in their financial circumstances. Zara had insisted on lending Amara the dress, had sent her to a stylist friend who'd done her hair and makeup, had arranged for her own driver to pick Amara up, so she'd arrive not in a taxi, but in a car that announced she belonged here, even if she didn't feel like she did. And now, watching them watch each other across the ballroom with the kind of electric awareness that made the air between them practically visible, Zara felt a surge of satisfaction that what she'd hoped might happen was actually happening in real time. She saw her uncle's expression shift, almost imperceptibly, saw the way his attention that was usually so carefully distributed to maximize strategic advantage suddenly focused entirely on one person, as if everyone else had simply ceased to exist. And she knew with absolute certainty that Kwame Osei, the Ice King, was about to melt for the first time in his adult life. The moment arrived with the weight of destiny wrapped in the mundane. A waiter passing too close to Amara, his tray tilting, champagne glasses beginning their inevitable slide toward gravity and disaster. Time seemed to slow as Amara reached out with reflexes sharpened by years of catching falling children and rescuing cooking pots, tipping off unstable stoves, her hand steadying the tray before a single glass could shatter against the marble floor. The waiter, young and clearly new to this kind of high-stakes service, looked at her with such profound gratitude that she smiled and said something Kwame couldn't hear from across the room, but could read on her lips, something kind and reassuring that made the young man's panic dissolve into relief. It was such a small moment, such an insignificant interaction in a ballroom full of people pursuing important conversations with influential contacts. But for Kwame, it was everything, because it told him something essential about who Amara was when no one she needed to impress was watching. She possessed what his wealth had never been able to buy, or his power command, the instinct to help someone who could do absolutely nothing for her in return, to treat a struggling waiter with the same dignity she'd offer a CEO. Kwame found himself moving toward her before consciously deciding to do so, his body responding to a pull he couldn't name but also couldn't resist, navigating through clusters of conversation with the kind of purposeful movement that made people instinctively part to let him through. He was aware of eyes following his trajectory, aware of whispered speculation about why the notoriously aloof Kwame Osei was cutting through a crowded ballroom with such obvious intention, aware that this moment would become gossip by morning and a story that circulated through social networks for weeks. None of it mattered, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kwame wasn't thinking 3 moves ahead, wasn't calculating the strategic implications of his actions, wasn't performing the careful choreography of corporate socializing that had become his default mode of existence. He was simply moving towards something, someone, who'd managed to penetrate defenses he'd thought were impenetrable, who'd reminded him with a single small gesture of kindness that the world contained beauty his cynicism had taught him to dismiss as naive fantasy. When he stopped in front of Amara, close enough to catch the subtle scent of cocoa butter on her skin, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark brown eyes, the rest of the ballroom faded into background noise. "That was impressively quick reflexes," Kwame said, his voice carrying that low rumble that made board members lean forward to catch every word, and competitors unconsciously straighten their spines in automatic deference to power. Amara looked up at him with those remarkable eyes that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for, and for a moment she seemed startled, as if she hadn't expected the famous Kwame Osei to notice something as insignificant as her saving a waiter from embarrassment and possible job loss. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but steady, carrying none of the calculated breathiness that so many women adopted when speaking to him. No performance of attraction or ambition, just genuine surprise at being noticed. "I grew up catching things before they fell. Old habits." There was something in the simplicity of that statement that cracked Kwame's heart open a little wider. The casual reference to a childhood where you learned to be quick because broken things couldn't easily be replaced, where reflexes were sharpened by necessity rather than optional sports training, where wasting anything was a sin against family and community who'd sacrificed so you could have even those modest possessions worth catching. "Kwame Osei," he said, extending his hand in a formal introduction that felt absurdly unnecessary given that everyone in this ballroom knew exactly who he was. But somehow with her, it felt important to introduce himself as a person rather than a reputation. "Amara Obenewa," she replied, placing her hand in his and meeting his gaze with a directness that surprised and pleased him, because so few people looked at him like he was simply another human being rather than a walking bank account or a networking opportunity or a prize to be won. Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, her palm slightly calloused from work that left marks, and Kwame found himself holding her hand a moment longer than professional courtesy required, reluctant to break the physical connection that somehow conveyed more warmth than any conversation he'd had in the past 5 years. "I know who you are," Amara added, a hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "You're Zara's uncle. She talks about you often." The reminder that she knew him through his niece should have created comfortable distance, should have placed their interaction in the safe zone of extended social networks, where everything was friendly but nothing was personal. But instead, it only made Kwame more curious about what exactly Zara had said, what pictures she'd painted of her isolated uncle, to this woman who looked at him without either worship or judgment. They talked for 20 minutes that felt like 20 seconds, standing near the ballroom's edge while the gala swirled around them, their conversation covering territory that ranged from Amara's studies in business management to Kwame's early struggles building his company, to a surprisingly deep discussion about whether true success could be measured by wealth accumulation or whether it required something more essential that couldn't be quantified in annual reports. Amara spoke about wanting to create programs that would help rural communities access education and economic opportunities without having to abandon their homes and traditions the way so many people felt forced to do. About her belief that development didn't have to mean destroying the very things that made communities strong in their cohesion and mutual support. Kwame found himself genuinely engaged in a way he rarely experienced at these events, where conversations were usually polite, exchanges of rehearsed talking points designed to convey success and sophistication without revealing anything authentic. Here was someone who cared about something beyond her own advancement, who'd actually thought about the complicated relationship between economic development and cultural preservation, who wasn't afraid to challenge his assumptions with intelligence and passion while remaining completely respectful of his experience and expertise. "You should come visit my office sometime," Kwame heard himself say, the words emerging before his cautious corporate brain could veto them, before he could consider the implications of inviting this woman into his space, before he could calculate whether this was wise or strategic or aligned with his carefully maintained boundaries. "I have a team working on rural development initiatives. Your perspective would be valuable." Amara looked at him with surprise that gradually shifted into something that might have been hope, tempered by realism, as if she wanted to believe he was sincere, but had learned through hard experience that powerful people often made offers they never intended to follow through on. "I wouldn't want to take up your time," she said carefully, giving him an easy out, if this was just polite conversation rather than genuine invitation. "I mean it," Kwame insisted, pulling out his phone and handing it to her with a directness that was probably too aggressive for a first conversation, but felt completely natural in the moment. "Put your number in. My assistant will coordinate a time that works for you. And, Amara—" He waited until she looked up from the phone to meet his eyes. "I don't make offers I don't intend to keep. It's inefficient and disrespectful. If I'm inviting you to my office, it's because I genuinely want your input, not because I'm being polite." What Kwame didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he wanted to see her again, not because of her ideas about rural development, though those were genuinely interesting, but because talking to her had reminded him what it felt like to connect with another human being without the filter of calculation and strategy that had become his default setting for all interactions. When Zara appeared a few minutes later to reclaim her friend, claiming they needed to say hello to some foundation donors, Kwame watched Amara disappear into the crowd with something that felt uncomfortably close to longing, an emotion he'd successfully avoided for most of his adult life. He stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, trying to understand why a 20-minute conversation with someone he'd just met had affected him more than relationships he'd maintained for years, trying to decide whether this feeling was something to pursue or something to shut down before it became a complication he couldn't afford. The rational part of his brain, the part that had built an empire through careful risk assessment and emotional control, was already listing all the reasons why getting involved with Amara Obanewa would be a mistake. She was young, inexperienced in his world, Zara's best friend, which complicated family dynamics, and most dangerously, she seemed to see him as a person, rather than a position, which meant she might actually touch the parts of him he kept hidden behind professional competence and calculated distance. But there was another part of Kwame, a part he'd thought had died with his father, or been killed by years of betrayals and disappointments, that was whispering different advice, suggesting that maybe the biggest risk wasn't opening himself to potential hurt, but rather continuing to live behind walls so high that nothing could reach him, neither pain nor joy, neither failure nor authentic connection. That night, after the gala ended, and he returned to his penthouse apartment, with its stunning views and luxurious emptiness, Kwame stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights, and admitted something he'd been avoiding for years. He was profoundly lonely in a way that no amount of success could fix, isolated by his own defenses, to the point where he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. He thought about Amara's hand in his, about the way she'd looked at him with interest, but without hunger, about her laugh when he'd made a self-deprecating joke about his first disastrous business presentation, about the intelligence and compassion that seemed to flow from her naturally rather than being performed for effect. And he wondered, with a mix of terror and hope he hadn't felt in decades, whether she might be the person who could teach him how to be human again, how to connect rather than just network, how to feel rather than just function. The following Tuesday, Amara walked into the gleaming headquarters of Osei Enterprises, wearing her best interview outfit, a modest blazer and skirt combination that was professional if not expensive, her portfolio clutched in hands that were steadier than she felt inside. She'd debated for 3 days whether to actually show up for this meeting, wondering if Kwame's invitation had been genuine or just the kind of thing wealthy people said at parties, before forgetting about it entirely once they sobered up and returned to their real lives. But something in the way he'd looked at her, something in the intensity of his attention when they'd talked, had convinced her that he meant what he said, that this wasn't a game or a performance, but a genuine offer from someone who saw value in her perspective. The receptionist, a polished woman whose makeup and hair probably required more time than Amara spent getting ready in an entire week, directed her to the executive floor with a professional smile that conveyed absolutely nothing about whether she was expected or whether this was going to be an embarrassing mistake. The elevator rose 43 floors, and with each floor Amara felt her confidence simultaneously growing and wavering, proud of herself for being brave enough to show up, but also acutely aware that she was entering a world where she didn't speak the language or know the rules. Kwame's executive assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Abina, who'd been with him for 7 years and could read his moods better than anyone, showed Amara into his office with an expression of mild surprise that suggested visits from young women dressed like students rather than executives were not typical occurrences in Kwame Osei's carefully controlled schedule. The office itself was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic city views, furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, art on the walls that Amara suspected was worth more than her entire education, and bookshelves lined with volumes in multiple languages suggesting an intellect that constantly fed itself new information. Kwame rose from behind his desk when she entered, and Amara was struck again by how his physical presence seemed to fill space without effort, how the expensive suit he wore looked less like clothing and more like armor, or a uniform designating rank in some hierarchy where he occupied the top position. But then he smiled, just slightly, just enough to soften the hard edges, and Amara remembered that underneath the billionaire exterior was someone who'd grown up in circumstances not entirely unlike her own, someone who understood what it felt like to be underestimated and dismissed based on where you came from, rather than who you were. They spent 2 hours discussing her ideas for rural development, and what started as Amara nervously presenting concepts she'd worked on in her community college courses gradually transformed into a genuine exchange of ideas between two people who discovered they shared fundamental values about what development should accomplish. Kwame didn't just listen politely while waiting for his turn to speak, didn't just nod encouragingly before dismissing her ideas as naive or impractical. He engaged with her concepts seriously, asked probing questions that made her think more deeply about implementation challenges, shared his own experiences with projects that had failed, despite good intentions, because they hadn't adequately considered community needs and preferences. What emerged from their conversation was a vision for a new initiative that would combine Amara's understanding of rural community dynamics with Kwame's resources and business expertise, creating programs that would bring economic opportunities to underserved areas without requiring people to abandon their homes and cultures. By the end of the meeting, Kwame had made a decision that surprised even himself. He offered Amara a position as a consultant to his Rural Development Division, a role that would allow her to continue her studies while working part-time to develop and implement the programs they discussed. "I don't understand," Amara said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and suspicion that made Kwame appreciate her even more, because it meant she wasn't someone who accepted things at face value without questioning motives. "Why would you offer me this opportunity? I'm still in school. I have no professional experience. There must be dozens of qualified people who could do this job better." Kwame leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his dark eyes holding hers with a directness that felt almost intimate, despite the professional setting. "You're right, that there are people with more credentials and experience," he acknowledged. "But credentials don't automatically translate to understanding. You have something more valuable. You've lived the reality that we're trying to impact. You understand rural communities, not as abstract demographics to be served, but as real people with complex needs and valuable traditions that shouldn't be destroyed in the name of progress. That perspective, that authenticity, is worth more than any MBA." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "And I trust you. I don't trust many people, but there's something about you that tells me you'll always shoot straight, that you won't tell me what you think I want to hear, but what I actually need to know. That's rare. That's valuable. That's worth investing in." Over the following months, Amara became a regular presence at Osei Enterprises, coming in twice a week to work with Kwame's development team while maintaining her full course load, and somehow still finding time to volunteer at the literacy program, because that's who she was, someone who couldn't turn off her instinct to help, even when she was stretched so thin that rest became a luxury she couldn't afford. She and Kwame developed a working relationship that was professional on the surface, but charged with an undercurrent of something neither was ready to name or acknowledge, a connection that expressed itself in conversations that ran long past scheduled meeting times, in the way Kwame found excuses to stop by the conference room where Amara worked to ask questions he could have easily emailed, in how Amara's entire demeanor brightened when she heard his voice in the hallway approaching her workspace. Zara watched this dance with knowing amusement and growing hope, seeing her uncle slowly come back to life in ways she'd never witnessed, noticing how he laughed more easily, how the permanent tension in his shoulders seemed to ease when Amara was around, how he talked about future plans with an enthusiasm that had been missing from his life for as long as Zara could remember. The turning point came 6 months into their working relationship, during a field visit to a rural community where they were piloting one of Amara's program ideas, a micro-lending initiative combined with business training that was designed to help small farmers increase productivity without getting trapped in predatory debt cycles. Kwame had insisted on coming along, despite his assistant's protests that his schedule couldn't accommodate a 3-day trip to a village with limited internet and no 5-star accommodations, because he'd learned that the only way to truly understand whether programs were working was to see them in action rather than reviewing reports filtered through multiple layers of management. The village welcomed them with the kind of generous hospitality that people who have little somehow manage to offer more freely than those who have everything. And Kwame found himself sitting under a baobab tree, eating food prepared over an open fire, listening to farmers discuss their challenges and dreams in animated conversation that required Amara to translate from the local dialect. He watched her in her element, saw how naturally she connected with these people who were her people, noticed how her education and city polish hadn't diminished her ability to sit comfortably on the ground and laugh at jokes told in languages he didn't speak, while making everyone around her feel valued and heard. That night, after meetings ended, and the village settled into the quiet darkness that comes when there's no electricity to push back the night, Kwame and Amara sat outside the modest guest house where they'd been given separate rooms, looking up at stars so bright and numerous that they seemed unreal after years of city living where light pollution bleached out celestial beauty. They talked about everything and nothing, about Kwame's father, who'd sacrificed everything for his education, about Amara's grandmother, who'd sold precious family heirlooms to give her granddaughter a chance, about the strange paths that had led them both from villages like this one to the corporate towers where they now work together. And somewhere in that conversation, in the darkness that made honesty easier, because you couldn't see the other person's reactions clearly enough to regret vulnerability, Kwame found himself saying things he'd never told anyone, admitting how lonely success had made him, how he'd built walls to protect himself from people who wanted to use him and had ended up imprisoning himself instead, how he'd forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone who saw him as Kwame, rather than as the CEO of Osei Enterprises or the billionaire whose favor could transform careers and open doors. "I see you," Amara said quietly, her voice floating through the darkness like a promise or a benediction. "Not the empire or the net worth or the reputation. I see the man who remembers what it's like to be underestimated because of where you came from. I see someone who's brilliant and driven, but also kind in ways he tries to hide because he thinks kindness is weakness in the world he operates in. I see someone who's lonely, even though he's constantly surrounded by people, because none of those people are allowed close enough to touch the real person underneath the professional mask." Her words landed like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through Kwame's carefully constructed emotional defenses, reaching places he'd thought were permanently sealed off from human contact. He turned to look at her in the starlight, this remarkable woman who'd somehow seen through all his protection to the vulnerable human core he'd spent decades hiding, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. Some door he'd thought was permanently locked, suddenly swinging open to let in light and air, and the terrifying possibility of genuine connection. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words coming out raw and unfiltered, in a way nothing he said ever was, stripped of the control and polish that usually characterized every syllable he spoke. "Afraid of what?" Amara asked gently. "Of this. Of you. Of feeling something real, after so many years of feeling nothing." What happened next happened slowly and inevitably, like sunrise after long darkness, like rain after drought, like destiny fulfilling itself, despite human resistance and fear. Kwame reached for Amara's hand, tentatively, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't, instead turning her palm up to receive his touch, like it was something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, not speaking because words would have been inadequate for what was passing between them, a recognition that this connection was something neither had expected but both desperately needed, that they'd found in each other something the world insisted shouldn't work. The billionaire and the village girl, the ice king and the woman whose warmth could melt glaciers, the man who'd forgotten how to trust, and the woman whose authenticity made trust feel safe again. When they finally returned to the city 3 days later, something fundamental had changed between them, a shift from professional collaboration to something deeper and more dangerous, something that made Kwame's assistant raise her eyebrows when she noticed how his entire demeanor transformed when Amara entered his office, something that made Zara grin, like someone watching a plan come together exactly as hoped. But falling in love, real love, the kind that transforms rather than just entertaining, is never simple or straightforward, especially when the two people involved come from worlds that aren't supposed to intersect, when society has clear ideas about who belongs with whom, and those ideas don't include billionaire CEOs, dating community college students who work 3 jobs and come from villages most of the social elite couldn't find on a map. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading through Kwame's social and business circles, like wildfire through dry grass, fed by jealousy from women who'd tried and failed to capture his attention, and by skepticism from men who couldn't understand why someone with Kwame's options would choose someone so obviously outside his social class. Amara heard the whispers too, in the restrooms at company events, where women who didn't know, she could hear them discussed, whether she was using him for money, or whether he was having some kind of midlife crisis that made him temporarily forget his position and responsibilities. The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit, not because she believed them, but because they confirmed her deepest fear, that no matter how she felt about Kwame, or how he felt about her, the world would never accept their relationship as legitimate, would always see her as the opportunistic village girl who'd somehow seduced a man too good for her. Kwame felt the pressure too, faced questions from board members who wondered if his personal entanglements might affect his judgment, fielded comments from supposed friends who suggested he was being naive or taken advantage of by someone who clearly understood the financial benefits of catching a billionaire's attention. What frustrated him most was that he couldn't defend their relationship publicly without making Amara uncomfortable, couldn't stand up in front of everyone and declare that she was the most genuine person he'd ever met without sounding like he was trying to convince himself as much as them, couldn't explain that her lack of wealth and social connections was exactly what made her valuable to him, because it meant she wanted him for who he was, rather than what he had. So instead, he did what he'd always done when faced with opposition. He doubled down, making Amara's role in his company more prominent and official, bringing her to high-profile events as his guest rather than as Zara's friend, making it clear through actions rather than words that she mattered to him in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. But the more visible their connection became, the more intense the scrutiny grew, until Amara felt like she was living under a microscope, where every outfit choice, every word she spoke, every gesture she made was analyzed and judged by people looking for evidence that she didn't belong in Kwame's world. The breaking point came at a major industry gala, One of those events where business titans and politicians and socialites gathered to see and be seen, to make deals and alliances over champagne and carefully plated food that was more art than sustenance. Amara had been reluctant to attend, feeling increasingly exhausted by the constant scrutiny and the whispered commentary that followed her everywhere in Kwame's world. But he'd asked her to come, as his official date, rather than as part of Zara's group, and she'd agreed because she loved him, even though she'd never said the words out loud. Loved him enough to endure the discomfort of being constantly judged and found wanting by people whose approval meant nothing to her personally, but everything to his business and social standing. She'd worn a beautiful dress that Zara had helped her pick out, had her hair and makeup done professionally, had prepared herself mentally for another evening of fake smiles and careful conversations with people who looked at her like she was a curiosity or a mistake rather than a person. What she hadn't prepared for was the confrontation that happened in the ballroom's elegant restroom, where she'd retreated for a moment of peace and found herself face to face with three women whose designer dresses probably cost more than Amara's entire year's salary. Women whose beauty was enhanced by expensive procedures and whose confidence came from never having questioned their right to occupy spaces like this. "You must be so proud of yourself," one of them said, her voice dripping with venom, disguised as sweetness, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Managing to trap Kwame Osei when so many others have tried and failed. Tell us, what's your secret? Because it certainly isn't your wardrobe, or your pedigree, or your connections." The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded, landing like physical blows against Amara's already fragile confidence. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that she'd never trapped anyone, that she'd actually resisted this relationship because she knew exactly how it would look to people like this, that Kwame had pursued her, not the other way around. But before she could formulate a response, another woman joined the attack. "We all know how this ends. Girls like you always think you're special until they realize that men like Kwame Osei don't actually marry the help. He'll have his fun, maybe set you up in a nice apartment, and then he'll marry someone from his own world who actually understands the responsibilities that come with his position. You're a temporary distraction, not a permanent fixture." The third woman laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Honestly, it's almost sad. She probably actually believes he loves her, like a fairy tale where the prince marries the peasant. Except this isn't a fairy tale, darling. This is the real world, where people stay in their lanes, and everyone is happier for it." Amara stood there, frozen by humiliation and hurt, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of these women who'd already seen too much of her vulnerability. What none of them knew, what Amara didn't know until later, was that Kwame had followed her to the restrooms after noticing she'd been gone too long, had been standing just outside the door and heard every venomous word, every calculated cruelty designed to make Amara doubt herself and him, and the relationship they'd been building, despite the world's skepticism. He waited until the three women emerged, their faces showing satisfaction at having delivered their message, and then he did something that immediately became legendary in their social circles, something that would be discussed and analyzed for years afterward. He walked past them without acknowledging their existence, entered the restroom, where Amara stood, trying to compose herself, and dropped to one knee in front of her while pulling a ring box from his pocket, a box containing a diamond he'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that he now realized would never come, because perfect moments were myths, and what mattered was commitment and courage, and choosing love over fear regardless of timing or circumstance. "Amara Obenewa," he said, his voice carrying that deep certainty that made board members trust his judgment and competitors respect his decisions. I love you not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Not because you fit into my world, but because you've shown me that my world was too small and too cold and too empty before you entered it. Marry me. Not someday when circumstances are right or when other people approve, but now, soon, as quickly as you'll have me. Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you're not a temporary distraction, but the permanent center of everything that matters. Marry me, and teach me how to be as brave and authentic and genuinely good as you are. Marry me because I'm terrified of living another day in the fortress I built to protect myself from feeling exactly what I feel for you right now. And Amara, looking down at this brilliant, powerful man, kneeling before her in a restroom, while a gala continued outside without them, laughed through her tears and said the only word that mattered, yes, moral. When you find someone who loves your character more than your credentials, who values your authenticity over your achievements, who sees your worth when the world measures you by different standards, hold on to that love fiercely, because it's rarer and more precious than any treasure the world considers valuable.